The camera opens on a decaying plantation mansion, shuttered windows staring like hollow eyes. The wind whistles through broken eaves, carrying whispers of names never spoken aloud. In the distance, a child's laughter, a sound sweet and hollow, echoes over the blackened fields. By the 8th second, the narrator cuts in. No one remembers her name. No one knows the cries she left behind. But at Blackridge Plantation, the air itself remembers. A fog of rot and rain settles over the estate, clinging to the bones of forgotten men. Here, in the heart of the American South between 1830 and 1850, an unthinkable secret festered, buried beneath the veneer of polite society, under the guidance of a man whose power knew no moral boundary. The plantation master, whose reputation in town was that of philanthropy and religious piety, harbored a darkness that twisted blood and obedience alike. And at the center of it was his daughter, a girl whose body and mind were instruments of control, who became both witness and victim to horrors that no human was meant to endure. The story begins in whispers, chains dragged through dirt, the creak of a bed frame, and the rhythmic, orchestrated terror that permeated every room. This is not simply a tale of cruelty. It is a ritual of ownership, of ancient trauma reshaped by wealth and impunity. By the time the sun rises over Blackridge, the audience already understands. Something monstrous lived here, and history has chosen to forget. Blackridge Plantation was built in the late 1820s, rising like a fortress over acres of cotton and river mist. Townsfolk whispered that its master, Jonathan Blackridge, descended from one of the original settlers, a family whose wealth was steeped in both land and secrecy. The mansion itself was a cathedral of oppression, high ceilings, dark wood panels carved with symbols of loyalty and obedience, and rooms that seemed to swallow sound. Servants often reported strange echoes, the laughter of children in empty hallways, shadows that lingered too long. Official records painted Blackridge as a benefactor, donating to churches, funding orphanages, but diaries hidden in the attic told a different story. In the private journals of his daughter Eleanor, a girl of formidable girth and trembling spirit, there was a coded language of survival. She described lessons in obedience, instruction in silence, and rituals her father demanded to ensure the complete submission of the enslaved men who labored on the land. Eleanor's writing hints at a psychological training, a perverse education designed to make her both complicit and a weapon in her father's control. She noted how the other children in the nearby town were kept at bay, warned never to approach the plantation, and how the church masked the estate's sins with sermons of virtue. In the plantation ledger, numbers seemed innocuous: groceries, livestock, tools. But hidden within were the records of labor hours and punishments, meticulously detailing the human lives twisted beneath wealth and religious morality. Eleanor grew isolated. At 11, she was already different, larger than other girls, painfully shy and subject to her father's exacting standards. Her education was peculiar. She was tutored in music and etiquette, but also observed men in ways that no child should ever witness. She wrote of the air inside her home. It tastes of iron and fear, and the walls remember everything. Servants whispered of the ritualistic nature of her father's commands, how Eleanor was groomed as an intermediary, a human conduit through which Jonathan exerted his dominion. She slept in a room that was simultaneously a nursery, a classroom, and a chamber of punishment. Every sound in the night, the footsteps of men in chains, the soft weeping of her own body, was meticulously catalogued in her mind. Her father's obsession with control extended beyond the plantation gates. He demanded complete secrecy, ensuring that the local clergy, who blessed the estate's wealth, never suspected the atrocities that occurred under candlelight. Eleanor's journals described feelings of shame and fear, mingled with an obedience born of survival, a psychological labyrinth in which she was both victim and enforcer. Even in sleep, she was trained to recognize the steps of those who entered her father's chamber, the faint scent of tobacco and sweat, the subtle variations in tone when he whispered orders. The estate itself seemed alive, a breathing, sentient entity feeding on compliance and dread. Jonathan Blackridge's obsession with control was unparalleled. In town he was admired, a devout man who led the Sunday sermons with the authority of divine right. But inside the mansion, he wielded authority like a scalpel, cutting into the lives of those under his roof. Eleanor's body, he decided, would become a tool, an instrument of domination over the enslaved men whose labor built his fortune. He viewed it not as cruelty, but as a natural order, a grotesque extension of hierarchy, faith, and blood. Eleanor wrote in hidden margins of her journal, "I am his shadow. I cannot breathe without his command." The enslaved men, some no older than 15, were summoned to her chambers with strict instructions. The estate itself provided cover. Laborers came and went under the pretense of work. Nights were long, suffused with the scent of sweat, tobacco, and candle wax, the only light flickering over polished floors and the child's trembling body. Eleanor's psychology fractured. Obedience became instinct, shame became routine, and fear became the language of survival. The mansion, the estate, the river, and the blackened fields, everything conspired to make secrecy absolute. Even the family dog chained in the corner was said to sense the tension, growling at shadows that were already too heavy with guilt to be seen. In this twisted hierarchy, Jonathan Blackridge was both god and warden, Eleanor both instrument and victim, and the enslaved men mere ghosts in a nightmare made flesh. By the mid-1830s, Eleanor's role was formalized. Jonathan orchestrated nights that followed strict rituals, timed, documented, and rehearsed in the dim candlelight of the upstairs chambers. Each man who entered was catalogued in the father's ledger with precise initials, age, and a tally of obedience hours. Eleanor described these nights with terrifying clarity, the smell of candle wax melting into floorboards, the creak of the wooden bed, the chill of the river air that seeped through cracks in the window, and the unyielding silence demanded of her. Her father's philosophy was simple. Submission bred power, power bred wealth, and secrecy ensured survival. She was taught to smile at the men, to nod, to show consent that was never hers. Psychological conditioning intertwined with physical trauma, creating a recursive cycle where Eleanor could not distinguish between her own body and the will imposed upon it. Servants who glimpsed her during these hours often fell ill or disappeared, leaving behind only whispered rumors. Townsfolk spoke of the girl's odd comportment, her sudden growth and peculiar weight, but no one questioned Jonathan Blackridge. The church's blessing was a protective veneer, hiding the rot beneath. Eleanor's diary entries began to reflect dissociation, a mental retreat into herself where she imagined being free, somewhere far from Blackridge. Yet every morning, she awoke to the same mansion, the same halls, the same oppressive expectation. The enslaved men were shadows within the estate, invisible to polite society but painfully present to Eleanor. Their eyes, often averted, betrayed a mixture of terror, shame, and resignation. Some whispered warnings to each other. Others succumbed to quiet despair. Jonathan's obsession elevated Eleanor above human decency, turning her into an unwilling mediator of cruelty. The nights were orchestrated with precision. Footsteps on the polished floors, the faint rustle of cotton garments, the smell of sweat, and the rhythmic pounding of hearts against chests too heavy with fear. Eleanor noted in her journal that sometimes the men seemed to become figures of ritual themselves, bodies reduced to obedience under her father's direction. She wrote, "I see them in the daylight, shadows of men whose names I cannot speak. At night I touch what is forbidden. At dawn, I am nothing." Blackridge Plantation functioned as a microcosm of oppression, a house where control over bodies, desire, and knowledge converged. Outsiders heard only the laughter of children or the bell of the church steeple. Within, however, Eleanor's reality was a perpetual corridor of surveillance, punishment, and unnatural obedience. Outside Blackridge, the surrounding town was a model of piety. Churches flourished, Schools thrived and families gathered on Sundays, oblivious to the horrors nearby. Jonathan Blackridge was a pillar of the community, a man whose word carried weight in legal and religious circles. Neighbors noticed Eleanor's size and peculiar demeanor, but attributed it to diet or illness, never questioning the undercurrents of trauma that shaped her. Rumors occasionally circulated, strange noises, missing laborers, but fear of the powerful Blackridge name ensured silence. Letters were intercepted, visitors discouraged, and the law carefully sidestepped any intrusion. Eleanor became a specter in her own home, her father's gaze a constant reminder that the outside world was both dangerous and irrelevant. Her diary, hidden beneath floorboards, captured the dissonance between public virtue and private horror, revealing a psychological torment amplified by isolation, complicity, and enforced secrecy. In Eleanor's world, salvation was neither spiritual nor earthly. It existed only in fleeting moments of dissociation, a fragile mental escape from the architectural and emotional prison her father constructed. As Eleanor aged, her body and mind bore the cumulative weight of her father's rituals. The mansion seemed to pulse with expectation, rooms vibrating with the invisible presence of past events. She described the heaviness of her body in her journals, the way her own limbs felt foreign, the way touch could simultaneously wound and numb. Every interaction was governed by protocol. The slightest misstep could result in punishment not just for her, but for the men whose lives intersected with her nightly ordeal. She noted that she often dreamt of doors that led nowhere, corridors lined with mirrors that reflected not her face but her compliance. The psychological imprint of her father's control extended beyond the bedroom, seeping into meals, music lessons, and walks along the riverbank. Eleanor's adolescence became a labyrinth of ritualized obedience, shame, and complicit complicity, where survival demanded silence, and memory became both weapon and prison. Visitors to Blackridge sensed something wrong but could not articulate it, a stench of sorrow and submission that clung to the air. Eleanor, meanwhile, wrote with meticulous care, encoding trauma into language that could survive even if she could not. Jonathan Blackridge maintained an unassailable position of moral authority. He financed the local church, orchestrated sermons on virtue, and hosted community events that masked the plantation's horrors. Clergy and townsfolk alike praised his generosity, blind to the shadows behind the grand windows. Eleanor's diary reveals the chilling irony. They speak of God above. I speak of God beneath. They see charity. I see chains. The church's blessings provided legitimacy to the estate's operations, giving Jonathan impunity while Eleanor remained trapped. The rituals he enforced were framed as moral exercises, a grotesque perversion of faith, obedience, and patriarchal control. Even the ministers who occasionally visited sensed unease in the halls, but explained it away as superstition or illness. Eleanor's writings indicate an acute awareness of complicity. The adults in her world knew more than they admitted, and their silence became an extension of her father's dominion. She observed the paradox daily, public virtue and private horror coexisting, sustained by fear, ritual, and belief. The estate's corruption was not isolated. It was reinforced by institutions, traditions, and the unquestioning obedience of those outside its walls. Jonathan's interest in control extended beyond Blackridge. He contributed to a nearby orphanage, sending children under the guise of charity while monitoring their growth, health, and behavior. Eleanor's writings suggest that these children were quietly observed, sometimes tested against lessons in obedience she had endured. The orphanage functioned as both a social shield and a laboratory of control, a place where Jonathan's philosophy could be replicated, refined, and expanded beyond his own estate. Eleanor recalled the suffocating scent of candle wax and disinfectant, mingled with the fear of the unseen, the quiet whimpering of those who did not yet understand obedience. She wrote of secret rules, whispered threats, and corridors where even the walls seemed to bend to her father's will. The town remained unaware, celebrating Jonathan's philanthropy while the plantation's rituals echoed in parallel. Eleanor's awareness of the broader network of control deepened her psychological entrapment, making her complicit not only in her own torment, but in the subtle propagation of her father's twisted ideology. Trauma, secrecy, and control intertwined, creating a lattice of oppression whose threads stretched far beyond Blackridge's boundaries. Eleanor's adulthood brought neither freedom nor release. Each night she relived the rituals, the footsteps, the whispers. The men's eyes turned toward her as both object and enforcer. Memory became a cage. She could recall every scent, every creak of floorboards, every detail of her father's orchestration. Eleanor's journals are harrowing records of dissociation, coping, and the subtle madness bred by prolonged abuse. She described feeling as though she were split into multiple selves: the obedient daughter, the complicit enforcer, the traumatized child, and the observer recording the horrors. Each identity battled for dominance, leaving her fragmented, vulnerable, and isolated. The mansion seemed to absorb her pain, echoing it back in the groan of timbers, the whistle of wind, and the creak of doors that refused to close. Even as the wider world moved on, the plantation remained suspended in time, a dark ecosystem of control, secrecy, and ritualized trauma. Eleanor's writings suggest that the weight of memory itself was a tool her father wielded, ensuring that she would never escape the mansion, the estate, or the unseen chains of compliance. By the 1850s, whispers began to surface. Servants vanished without explanation. Some townsfolk reported hearing cries in the night, and Eleanor's own health declined. The mansion's walls, once silent witnesses, now seemed to conspire against her, revealing the unbearable weight of suppressed truth. Eleanor's diaries describe moments of near madness, hallucinations, visions of the men who had suffered, shadows that moved without bodies. Jonathan's control, once absolute, began to falter as the layers of secrecy became harder to maintain. Yet still the town refused to confront reality. Public appearances remained flawless, sermons continued, and Blackridge's reputation endured. Eleanor's psyche fractured further, caught between obligation, fear, and the growing recognition that her father's dominion might outlast her own ability to endure. The mansion itself seemed aware of her suffering, the ceilings dripping with condensation, floors warped with age, the faint scent of decay intermingled with candle wax and sweat. The estate had become a living, breathing testament to the destructive power of secrecy, trauma, and unquestioned authority. One night, Eleanor vanished. Official records claim she eloped with a distant cousin. Town gossip whispers of a mental breakdown. But her diaries, discovered decades later hidden beneath floorboards, tell a different story. Eleanor describes a final night where she deliberately misstepped, defied her father, and entered forbidden spaces. She observed rooms untouched for years, found evidence of past rituals, and confronted the depth of her father's corruption. In a moment of clarity and terror, she realized she could never fully escape. Not from the mansion, not from the memory, not from the power her father wielded. Her disappearance became a local legend, a cautionary tale, but the truth remained buried. Eleanor's flight was not freedom, but another ritual, a final, silent act of defiance against a life built on control, obedience, and enforced compliance. After Eleanor's disappearance, Blackridge Plantation fell into disrepair. Fields lay fallow, windows cracked, and the mansion rotted under sun, rain, and wind. Locals spoke of ghostly cries at night, the rustle of chains and shadows glimpsed through shattered panes. The Blackridge family name faded from prominence, but the estate's horrors lingered. Children dared not venture near, and the nearby church continued to function, oblivious to or deliberately ignoring the sins of the past. Scholars in the 20th century would later unearth fragments of Eleanor's journals, revealing the depth of psychological manipulation, ritualized abuse, and systemic complicity. These fragments painted a portrait of trauma that defied understanding: a child weaponized by a father, a community complicit in silence, a mansion that had absorbed the sins of generations. Eleanor's writings offer chilling insight into the mind of a survivor of ritualized familial abuse. She details dissociation, hypervigilance, and the strange detachment required to endure her father's orchestration. Her journals describe dreams where walls bend, men's eyes follow her, and her body obeys commands it no longer wants to execute. The psychological consequences were profound. Long-term anxiety, self-fragmentation, and an inability to reconcile public virtue with private horror. Blackridge Plantation became a study in systemic abuse, a case where family, religion, and societal silence intertwined to create unimaginable suffering. Eleanor's accounts serve as both testimony and warning, a reminder that power unchecked, cloaked in morality, breeds atrocities beyond comprehension. By the mid-20th century, Blackridge Plantation had all but disappeared from memory. Kelly's histories mention it only in passing, and the mansion was eventually consumed by forest and time. Yet the estate's legacy persists in whispers, folklore, and the fragments of Eleanor's journals. Scholars and historians who later uncovered these writings describe a place where trauma was meticulously engineered, where obedience and complicity were moralized, and where a child became both victim and instrument of systemic evil. The mansion, though gone, remains a symbol, a reminder of how secrecy, institutional authority, and familial power can converge to hide atrocities no one is meant to witness. Those who dared explore the plantation site in the 20th century reported sensations of being watched, sudden chills and faint cries carried on the wind. Trees seemed to lean toward visitors, roots snagging shoes, the earth damp with unspoken sorrow. Eleanor's presence, or the echo of it, haunted the grounds, a psychic imprint left by decades of trauma and ritualized suffering. Visitors claimed to see figures in the fog, glimpses of a large trembling girl moving silently among ruins, eyes hollow yet accusing. These accounts, though anecdotal, reinforce the story's unnerving reality, that spaces saturated with control, fear, and ritual retain memory, preserving trauma like sediment in soil. In the 1970s, construction crews unearthed a small box beneath the mansion's floorboards containing Eleanor's journals. The writing was meticulous, filled with coded language, detailed observations, and profound psychological insight. Researchers were stunned. A record not only of abuse, but of systemic complicity, of religious, familial, and societal structures that enabled it. The journals described rituals in precise detail, the transformation of the human body and psyche under control, and Eleanor's fractured sense of self. Their publication, decades later, shocked historians and true crime scholars alike, revealing a chapter of American history hidden in plain sight. Section 19. Modern Reflections. Blackridge Plantation stands as a cautionary tale, illustrating how unchecked power, societal complicity, and systemic secrecy create conditions for unimaginable abuse. Eleanor's story forces confrontation with uncomfortable truths, that trauma can be engineered, that silence protects perpetrators, and that institutional authority often masks corruption. Modern psychologists, historians, and survivors advocates study the estate as a case in psychological manipulation, ritualized abuse, and the haunting persistence of trauma. Her life, once buried beneath shame and fear, now serves as both testimony and warning. The wind through the ruins carries whispers of Eleanor's life, of men whose identities vanished under her father's orchestration, of a society that refused to see. Blackridge Plantation may have crumbled, but the trauma remains, etched into the land, the air, and the fragmented records left behind. Eleanor's story is a reminder that history is not only what is written, but also what is hidden, suppressed, and forgotten. The mansion, the rituals, the silent obedience, they endure as spectral testimony, a cautionary echo warning that cruelty thrives when secrecy and authority converge. In the end, the haunting is not only of a place but of memory itself, a darkness impossible to erase, a sorrow impossible to forget, a child's suffering preserved as both history and warning for generations yet to come.